Very much. I want to thank the organizers for bringing us all here together to discuss something very important, the governance of our world, actually, and what the good things are, what the deficiencies are, what can we do to strengthen the good institutions and to have the mandates of the different global and regional institutions in the right place. I think it's about 60 to 61 years after the Second World War. The first 30 years, I would say, had global institutions that were set up after that war with quite clear division of labor and their mandates. We had the United Nations. It was universal. It would look at security. It would take the overview of development. It would have programs that would help developing countries. It undersaw the process of decolonization in the first 10 to 20 years after the Second World War. And it did its job quite well for the first 30 years until about 1975. We had the IMF. It was created to ensure that there would be financial stability in the world and that finance would be the servant of the economy. It would not go wild like a mad dog and bite the owner. So we had fixed exchange rates, relative stability in exchange rates. We had capital controls by all countries to ensure that we would not have speculative capital flowing all over the world, disrupting trade and production. And that was the job of the IMF. And we had the World Bank that was meant to give development financing for projects to developing countries. Now, this changed from the mid-70s. The United Nations that had become very strong, for example, UNCTAD, that was the main trading negotiating forum with commodity agreements, that was the real trade negotiations going on. Nobody really bothered about what was happening in the gap. We had the WHO promoting health development and healthcare for all by the year 2000 in those days, with primary healthcare as the main theme. We had UNDP sending out economists to the third world countries, helping governments to draw up their 5-year development plans. But after the mid-70s, this thing changed, as we now know. The IMF changed its mandate. It became the liberalizer of finance rather than the manager and controller of finance. After the change in the Bretton Woods system, the fixed exchange rate system, now we have very rapid liberalization of finance with financial instruments, like derivatives and so on, and nobody understands, let alone be able to control. And we had, because of the debt crisis, the IMF and World Bank playing the role of setting the development agenda in the developing countries. We had the rise of the new international economic order and the collapse of the new international economic order, the rise and fall of the United Nations. And finally, we have the social movements and the NGOs that brings us all here. So what is it that we need to do? I think after 20, 25 years of transferring of economic policy making at the international and national level from the UN into the Bretton Woods institutions, we find that those policies did not really work. And therefore, there is now a clamor of countries who have been under the IMF and the World Bank to get out of the clutches of the IMF and the World Bank. The previous speaker was telling us how relieved he is that Brazil has won policy space to determine its own macroeconomic policy because it has prepaid, or it has already got out of the IMF and World Bank dependence. And many countries are doing so that can afford to do so. That's because the macroeconomic policies have, in the main, not worked for most countries that went under that medicine, as we know. Plus, the policy of very rapid liberalization in trade, finance, and investment has also not worked for many countries, because the poorer countries which open up their borders found that cheap imports destroyed their local industries and threatened their local agriculture. This is the case in many African countries, in many Latin American countries, in some Asian countries, and so on. So we need very important, quick reforms to the dominant macroeconomic policies that have been disseminated by the IFIs. And the opportunity is there, with debt cancellation in many lower-income countries, with middle-income countries prepaying their debts. But these reforms, which in a way have been pioneered by the ILO, which we are sitting in the ILO, through the Decent Work Program, the new macroeconomic policy that is required, this was discussed at the high-level ECOSOC recently, papers coming out of DESA, papers coming out of UNCTAD, papers coming out of ILO. The UN is beginning to re-energize itself on the alternative to structural adjustment. In the case of the WTO, as our colleague from Brazil has said, we are now facing an impasse. That impasse is due to the fact that there is a different paradigm coming out of the developing countries. They had to accept the Uruguay round because at that time the WTO that was emerging was a rich man's club. It still basically is a rich man's club, but it is also a multilateral institution struggling to find its multilateral identity. And with that, we have the rise of developing countries in their regional groupings, in their individual shapes and so on, insisting that we have a development content to this round. But the old paradigm, represented by the major powers, is still that of extreme market access in terms of the developed countries getting into the developing countries, whilst at the same time preventing key market access into the developed countries, particularly in the area of agriculture, as we know. So, in a way, the paradigm of the North is liberalization is very good for the South, but protectionism is what we need in the North, and that's why we have protectionism in the area of agriculture continuing, and in TRIPS, preventing the transfer of technology. And in the South, in the past, they did accept liberalization because that's what they were told by the IFIs. It did not work for the last 20 to 30 years for many of them. And their paradigm is that we need to protect our small farmers and our collapsing industries from even more excessive imports, especially when agricultural subsidies are still there. And at the same time, we need market access to the North, and we are not getting it. And we need to protect ourselves in relation to intellectual property rights. Now, this big clash of paradigms is what has led to the impasse. And I agree with our colleague that the best solution is to get out of the impasse and to come out with a positive result that benefits the poorer countries. But I'm afraid that there are many elements in the present proposals on the tables, particularly in NAMA on industrial products, that if implemented would not lead to that result. So we need to review the framework even as we reopen the talks. We cannot reopen the talks and just continue business as usual on the same paradigm. Now, this leads us to the UN reform. I don't have much time. We have only 1 minute left. I think the coherence panel and the discussions around it will be very crucial to the future of the UN. It looks nice in terms of effectiveness and efficiency. One UN in each country, so you don't have all the different agencies anymore. It's more efficient. One UN at the headquarter level in a sense of off-budget financing will be channeled into one UN Millennium Fund. We'll still have different UN agencies for the time being, but a task force will look as to whether we should merge them and how we should merge them. I think this is the crux of the report. A strengthened ECOSOC in the sense that a leaders group of about maybe 30 leaders, political leaders, will meet under ECOSOC once a year, and you have a sustainable development board that will oversee the UN in the different countries and allocate the funds to them under the secretariat of a UN development group led by a UN coordinator, who will then receive applications from different agencies, receive the donor contributions, and then advise the Sustainable Development Board as to how to reallocate the money to the country level and so on.